So today we're going to learn a strategy for a step-by-step analysis of poetry. Poetry can be very challenging for students. It's not a lot of text, but it's very deep and very rich. There's usually a lot in there, and it usually requires even more reads than a normal narrative piece might require. And it's important that we know how to analyze poetry because it is such an important piece of our development as a reader. So today I'm going to teach you the acronym called TPCASTT. And this is a poetry analysis strategy that goes step by step through the steps of how to read a poem. And my goal is to teach this to you and use this strategy throughout the year. And what I'm hoping is that as we learn this strategy, that poetry will become a little bit easier for you, but that you'll also learn the steps of analysis so that you don't necessarily always have to have this outline next to you. It kind of just teaches you the steps that good readers go through. So people that have been doing this for quite a bit of time, they automatically go through these steps. But as we know that you're only a sixth grader, you're young still, you're still learning how to read poetry. You need a little bit of guidance. So we're going to go through this protocol. And we're going to go through a poem today that relates to 11, and we're going to use this strategy to analyze the poem, and we're going to see how it works for us. So TPCASTT, the T in TPCASTT makes sense. Basically, you start, the very first stage of TPCASTT is to analyze the title. Take a moment, look at the title that the poet has chosen, and ask yourself, what is the topic or subject of the poem based on the title? 9 times out of 10, you can answer that question by the title. Titles for poems are very, very carefully selected, so they don't happen by accident. And they very often have multiple meanings. So they have a meaning, a surface meaning, and then after you read the poem, they may have another meaning that you don't get until you've analyzed the poem. But the very first step is to look at the title and figure out what it's talking about. The second step is perhaps the most timely of all of the steps. And this cannot be skipped. This is where close reading skills come in. Basically, you need to read the poem line by line, stanza by stanza. And again, a stanza is like a paragraph within a poem. It's a section of lines that have their own rhyme scheme, or maybe they're not rhymed, in which case we call it blank verse. But we want to go line by line, and we want to literally paraphrase the poem. And to paraphrase the poem means to literally rewrite it in our own words. We don't want to skip this stage because this stage is where we really start to digest the poem and the meaning of the poem. And if we don't get the literal meaning of the poem, then there's very little chance that we're going to get that deeper meaning in the poem. The tone, the mood, the imagery, the symbolism, right? If we don't know the surface meaning, how are we ever going to get those things? So it's very, very important that we go step by step. The other reason that we do it this way is because this tells us where our difficulties lie in the poem. If we can't paraphrase a line, then we know that that line is difficult for us. And we may want to spend a little bit more time with it. We may want to ask the teacher for assistance. We may want to partner read this line with another classmate. So it's very important that we paraphrase the poem, and we do this by reading each line and rewriting what is being stated in each line in the margin. The C from TPCASTT is all around craft, and craft is really how a writer does what they do. Okay, it's their toolbox, right? So does the poem rhyme? That's part of craft. So some poems rhyme, some poems don't. And we want to analyze the author's craft. We want to look specifically for the imagery, okay, what pictures, what sensory details are being described in these poems, in this poem, okay? So you want to think about those winter poems that we analyzed, right? How they had all that sensory details and those sensory imagery. And we want to be looking and seeing if there's figurative language in there, okay? Are there similes? Are there metaphors in there? Is there personification? Are there some other poetic devices in there? This step takes a little bit of time, and it takes some knowledge of author's craft, poet's craft, but this is something that you can guarantee that you're going to be asked about poetic craft. because it's a very important part of poetry. Very often poets choose to put it in poetry so that they can use poetic devices versus putting it into a narrative. So it's important that we understand what the author chose or the poet chose to convey their messages and what techniques they're using. The A in TPCASTT refers to the attitude of the poet. So in some poems you read, the poet's going to be very happy and jovial and upbeat, right? And in some poems that you're going to read, that poet is downright depressed and not happy. And then you have a whole bunch of different emotions in between there. So when we're reading poetry, we want to be looking at our poet's attitude or thoughts and feelings about what they're talking about. And we want to be looking to see if it changes, because very often in poetry we have what we call a shift. And a shift is when a poet starts talking about something and feels one way, and then they start to feel some way different. So we want to be looking for that. Usually a shift, if we're going to see one, comes in the last couple stanzas. And the last thing you want to ask yourself in order to determine the poetic attitude or the mood is, how does a poem make you feel? What emotions are you feeling? So all of these questions kind of go together with poetic attitude. The S, we want to look for symbolism in our poem. We're not going to find it in every poem, but we want to be looking for those images within our poem that are very, very significant. So we want to be looking for images, trees, boats, animals, the sky. I mean, they're usually very obvious things, and they're chosen on purpose, but they very often don't stand alone and stand for themselves. They very often represent something else that the poet's trying to get at. So it's important that we notice those symbols that are repeated, and we'll learn more about that because symbolism can be very, very tricky for students in 6th grade. The T is to revisit the title. So now that you've looked at the author's craft, the poet's craft, you've paraphrased the poem, you've looked at the tone, you've looked at the mood, you've analyzed symbolism, you've found those poetic devices. Now you want to go back to the title just one more time. Do you have a new understanding of the title? Or does the meaning of the title change now that you've spent this time analyzing the poem? Sometimes you can answer yes to that question, sometimes you answer no. But I would tell you that a lot of times there will be new understanding after analyzing a poem. And the very last step in poetic analysis is to analyze theme. So theme is ultimately the life lesson, the takeaway that a reader can take from a poem. So just like a story, short story, or a book has a theme, so too does a poem. And it's basically the poet's message about life and love and relationships and family. It's usually going to be something very large. And it's going to relate to all those other devices that we've learned along the way. So that's why we leave it last. So remember, poems are tough. Poems are compact. There's a lot in there. And they take a lot of skill and a lot of time to analyze and get good at analyzing. Okay, so we're going to begin this process today, and I'm really going to go through it with you step by step. And as we move throughout the year, we're going to kind of continue to use this strategy over and over again, and you're going to see this video again. So let's give this our best shot. Let's look at a poem related to the short story we just read, and we're going to use the TPCASTT strategy with it.